Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video, and today I'm carrying on with my Victorian-style read-along of Charles Dickens's amazing novel Bleak House. So if you don't know, I'm currently hosting a Victorian-style read-along of Charles Dickens's Bleak House, where we read the book in the original serialised monthly parts. We're getting very near to the end now. This video I'm going to be talking about July's chapters, then there's only August chapters and September's chapters to go, and then we are done. So in the month of July we read the following three chapters. We read Chapter 54, Springing a Mine, quite a long chapter, Chapter 55, Flight, and Chapter 56, Pursuit. Lots to talk about here, lots of drama happening in these chapters. So let's start off with Chapter 54, Springing a Mine. Now, this is quite a dramatic chapter, a lot happens, a lot of plot stuff happens, it's also quite long, so I think like at least half this video is going to be about this chapter, I think, before I get on to the other two. So in this chapter we are following Mr. Bucket once again, and Mr. Bucket is getting close to fixing his case. He says to Sir Leicester Dedlock he has finally got proof of who committed the crime, but that it is not the soldier. He tells Sir Leicester Dedlock that he is going to shock him considerably, and then he tells him the story of Lady Dedlock and her past, of Lady Dedlock's complicated relationship with Mr. Tulkinghorn, of the fact that Lady Dedlock had a child with a man called Captain Horden out of wedlock, and the fact that Mr. Tulkinghorn knew this. He tells Sir Leicester Dedlock all of this, and Sir Leicester Dedlock groans and sits in silent amazement. And then a lot of noise comes from downstairs, and Mr. Bucket shows in a lot of people who also know the secret of Lady Dedlock's past, and who, after Mr. Tulkinghorn's death, have come to tell Sir Leicester Dedlock and try and get money from Sir Leicester Dedlock to stop them telling everybody. This is Mr. Smallweed and the Chasabons and Mrs. Snagsby, all of whom turn up and demand money basically to keep their story quiet. And we find out now that Mr. Smallweed had got those letters of Lady Dedlock's that she had written to Captain Horden from the house after Crook's death, that Mr. Smallweed sold them to Mr. Tulkinghorn, and that Mr. Bucket has now taken them from Mr. Tulkinghorn's house, and that they are in his possession. And all the way through these various confessions, Sir Leicester Dedlock sits immobile listening to everything they have to say. After Mr. Bucket has dismissed all of these people, he tells Sir Leicester Dedlock that he would advise Sir Leicester Dedlock paying them off to hush up the scandal of Lady Dedlock. And then he brings into the room Mademoiselle Hortense, who is very confused at what she's doing there, was directed to the house because she was told Mrs. Bucket would be there, because she, indeed, is Mr. and Mrs. Bucket's lodger. And then Mr. Bucket arrests her for the murder of Mr. Tulkinghorn. Shock, shock, shock. Wasn't Lady Dedlock or Mr. George after all. And he explains to Sir Leicester Dedlock the role Mademoiselle Hortense played in Mr. Tulkinghorn discovering Lady Dedlock's secret, and that she was very unhappy with Mr. Tulkinghorn and also with Lady Dedlock, and that therefore she murdered Mr. Tulkinghorn out of fury and then tried to frame Lady Dedlock because she hates Lady Dedlock so much, and that this is why she has done it. And that Mr. Bucket has been gathering evidence himself against her, but also got his wife to do the same. And Mrs. Bucket has been like tailing Hortense as well to kind of make sure that they both know what she's doing and that they can arrest her in the end. And at the end of the chapter, Mademoiselle Hortense is dragged off to prison by the police, who Mrs. Bucket called, and Mr. Bucket goes with them, leaving Sir Leicester Dedlock alone and astounded by everything he has just heard. He tries to rise from his seat and can barely support himself and sinks down on the ground. He also sort of begins to speak inarticulately, and the impression I've always had in this chapter is that Sir Leicester Dedlock suffers from a stroke because of his shock, but we can talk about that a little bit more in the next chapter. So, points of interest in this chapter. Goodness, a lot happens. There's a lot to talk about here. So many things. Where do we even begin? One thing I think that is very interesting to look at in this chapter is, why does Mr. Bucket tell Sir Leicester Dedlock everything? Because he doesn't have to, does he? He could arrest Hortense without telling Sir Leicester Dedlock everything. Now I think you can read it in one light as Mr. Bucket, he's solved the mystery and he wants to tell somebody and everyone that he has solved the mystery. He wants to show off everything he knows, and he sells Sir Leicester Dedlock because he can. But I think another way you can read it is that Mr. Bucket knows that Mr. Tulkinghorn's death will provoke people like Smallweed into thinking they can act on their own. Because the reason why Mr. Smallweed, for example, hadn't tried to blackmail Sir Leicester Dedlock on his own before was because he was kind of being held in check by Mr. Tulkinghorn, but now Mr. Tulkinghorn's dead, this brings Mrs. Smallweed and the rest out of hiding, and they do indeed come to blackmail Sir Leicester Dedlock. And Mr. Bucket tells Sir Leicester Dedlock the truth beforehand so that the truth can come from him as a slightly kinder person first. And also because it is important for him to make Sir Leicester Dedlock and also the police aware of the whole complicated situation with Mr. Tulkinghorn and Lady Dedlock, which is why Hortense was trying to like throw the crime on Lady Dedlock too. Mr. Bucket knows that the scandal will soon be out, and so he tells Sir Leicester Dedlock himself before this can happen. And also in that way he is able to kind of advise Sir Leicester Dedlock to try and get the scandal hushed up before it goes far and wide. And in this chapter, everything really does come out, and we learn everything that Mr. Tulkinghorn knows. Sir Leicester Dedlock, the deceased Mr. Tulkinghorn, was deep and close, and what he had fully in his mind in the very beginning, I can't quite take upon myself to say. But I know from his lips that he long ago suspected Lady Dedlock of having discovered through the sight of some handwriting in this very house, and when you yourself were present, Sir Leicester Dedlock, the existence in great poverty of a certain person who had been her lover before you courted her, and who ought to have been her husband. Mr. Bucket stops and deliberately repeats, ought to have been her husband, not a doubt about it. Just to explain, the emphasis there, ought to have been her husband, is basically Mr. Bucket saying they definitely slept together outside of wedlock, like they ought morally to have been married, they should have been married for the way they behaved, and that's what Mr. Bucket is implying in that sentence. I know from his lips that when that person soon afterwards died, he suspected Lady Dedlock of visiting his wretched lodgings and his wretcheder grave alone and in secret. I know from my own inquiries and through my eyes and ears that Lady Dedlock did make such a visit in the dress of her own maid, for the deceased Mr. Tulkinghorn employed me to reckon up her ladyship, if you'll excuse my making use of the term we commonly employ, and I reckoned her up, so far, completely. I confronted the maid in the chambers in Lincoln's Inn Field with a witness who had been Lady Dedlock's guide, and there couldn't be a shadow of the doubt in that she wore the young woman's dress unknown to her. Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, I did endeavour to pave the way a little towards these unpleasant disclosures yesterday by saying that very strange things happened in even high families sometimes. All this and more has happened in your own family and to and through your own lady. It's my belief that the deceased Mr. Tulkinghorn followed up these inquiries to the hour of his death, and that he and Lady Dedlock even had bad blood between them upon the matter, that very night. Now, only you put that to Lady Dedlock, Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, and ask her ladyship whether, even after he had left here, she didn't go down to his chambers with the intention of saying something further to him, dressed in a loose black mantle with a deep fringe to it. Sir Leicester sits like a statue, gazing at the cruel finger that is probing the lifeblood of his heart. And we get to Mr. Smallweed's story. I was the client and friend of Mr. Tulkinghorn. I did business to him. I was useful to him and he was useful to me. Crook, dead and gone, was my brother-in-law. I come into Crook's property. I examined all his papers and all his effects. They was all dug out under my eyes. There was a bundle of letters belonging to a dead and gone lodger, as was hid away in the back of the shelf in the side of Lady Jane's bed, his cat's bed. He hid all manner of things away, everywhere. Mr. Tulkinghorn wanted 'em and got 'em, but I looked over 'em first. I'm a man of business and I took a squint at 'em. They was letters from the lodger's sweetheart, and signed Honoria. Dear me, that's not a common name. Now when you're ready, says Mr. Bucket, to come to anything that concerns Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, here the gentleman sits, you know. Haven't I come to it, Mr. Bucket? Cries Grandfather Smallweed. Isn't the gentleman concerned yet? Not with Captain Horden and his ever-affectionate Honoria and their child into the bargain? And when Mrs. Chadban says her piece, she says, I helped to bring up Miss Horden, her ladyship's daughter. I was in the service of her ladyship's sister, who was very sensitive to the disgrace her ladyship brought upon her, and gave out even to her ladyship that the child was dead. She was very nearly so when she was born, but she's alive and I know her. And when all these people are finally got rid of, Mr. Bucket says to Sir Leicester Dedlock, it's for you to consider whether or not to buy this up. I should recommend on the whole it's being bought up myself, and I think it may be bought up pretty cheap. He suggests, in other words, that Sir Leicester Dedlock should pay these people to stop them spreading the story, and that that is the best way to stop that happening. And the moment of arrest of Mademoiselle Hortense needs to be told as well. It's very interesting and clever dramatic trick, because basically this chapter seems like it's leading up to the arrest of Lady Dedlock for having murdered Mr. Tulkinghorn, but actually Mr. Bucket arrests Hortense instead, but explains that she was trying to frame Lady Dedlock for it. And Hortense is furious throughout, but makes no attempt to deny it. She just tells Mr. Bucket that he's a devil and that she hates him, because she kind of hates everyone. She's quite a terrifying figure, and there's something kind of very violent and kind of animalistic in her violence. It's quite interesting to see Mademoiselle Hortense as quite a similar character to Madame Defarge in Tale of Two Cities, who is another very like violent, passionate French woman. Although Madame Defarge is a much more sympathetic character, sort of, than Mademoiselle Hortense. But I do think it's quite interesting to look at kind of similarities between them, and also to look at like how the French were considered by the British. Because of the French Revolution and the fact that there were multiple revolutions again in France throughout the 19th century, there is this kind of idea in Victorian Britain that France is a kind of place of violence and danger, and that French people are therefore a bit dangerous. So I do think that's important to consider in terms of how Mademoiselle Hortense is represented, is the kind of like English views of the French at the time. Mr. Bucket explains to Sir Leicester Dedlock all of the situation, and also that Hortense kind of made herself Mr. Bucket's lodger in order to kind of like watch him as well. And Mr. Bucket kind of conspired with his wife to trap Hortense and to prove that it was her. Hortense is infuriated and very, very angry and vicious throughout the whole thing, and she leaves saying that she pities and despises Sir Leicester Dedlock when she is taken away to be arrested. And now we come to the final moment of this chapter, which in many ways I find the most interesting in this chapter. And I'm going to read like a whole 4 paragraphs because I love this bit a lot. Sir Leicester, left alone, remains in the same attitude as though he was still listening and his attention was still occupied. At length he gazes round the empty room, and finding it deserted, rises unsteadily to his feet, pushes back his chair, and walks a few steps, supporting himself by the table. Then he stops, and, with more of those inarticulate sounds, lifts up his eyes and seems to stare at something. Heaven knows what he sees. The green, green woods of Chesney Wold, the noble house, the pictures of his forefathers, strangers defacing them, officers of police coarsely handling his most precious heirlooms, thousands of fingers pointing at him, thousands of faces sneering at him. But if such shadows flit before him to his bewilderment, there is one other shadow which he can name with something like distinctiveness even yet, and to which alone he addresses his tearing of his white hair and his extended arms. It is she, in association with whom, saving that she has been for years a main fibre of the root of his dignity and pride, he has never had a selfish thought. It is she whom he has loved, admired, honoured, and set up for the world to respect. It is she who has, at the core of all the constrained formalities and conventionalities of his life, been a stock of living tenderness and love, susceptible as nothing else is of being struck with the agony he feels. He sees her almost to the exclusion of himself, and cannot bear to look upon her cast down from the high place she has graced so well. And even to the point of his sinking on the ground, oblivious of his suffering, he can yet pronounce her name with something like distinctiveness in the middle of those intrusive sounds, and in a tone of mourning and compassion rather than reproach. Now I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the other 2 chapters as well, but I love Sir Leicester Dedlock. I think he's one of the best minor characters in Bleak House, and I think he is a fantastic character. One of the things I love about Sir Leicester Dedlock is that he is fully formed and complex, and that while he is a man full of pride and vanity and haughtiness, while he is a snob and self-obsessed and obsessed with his own family pride, he loves Lady Dedlock completely and truly and so much. He loves her entirely, and it has been one of the driving forces of his life, and his love for her is what makes him a good man, a true good man, and what makes me really love him as a character. The fact that for all his pride and for all his like disgust when a really similar story was told to him by Mr. Tulkinghorn like weeks before, for all his scorn of people who he views beneath him, like all he has is compassion for Lady Dedlock and how this will affect her. All he has is love for his wife, and I think he's amazing. So that's the end of that chapter. Now let's talk about chapter 55, Flight. Weirdly, we skip back in time for this chapter, which I think is an odd decision, and I'm trying to work out what the reason for it is. I almost feel like it's because Dickens just wants to reassure you that Lady Dedlock didn't kill Mr. Tulkinghorn, just in case you were worried. But anyway, we skip back in time, and we follow here Mrs. Bagnet, who has gone to collect Mrs. Rouncewell from Chesney Wold, because of course Mrs. Rouncewell is George's mother. She brings Mrs. Rouncewell to see George in prison, and George is like amazed and delighted to see her, though also like stressed about all of the kind of shame he's brought on the family by having not made very much for himself in his life and now being accused for murder. But also they are really happy to finally see each other. And Mrs. Rouncewell, desperate to do something for her son, goes to Lady Dedlock's household in town because she has received a note at Chesney Wold which says Lady Dedlock, murderess on it. And so she goes to Lady Dedlock certain in herself that Lady Dedlock could not have committed a murder, knowing Lady Dedlock well as she does, but feeling that perhaps Lady Dedlock might know something that might be able to get her son off. She begs Lady Dedlock that if she knows anything, to try and get her son off. And the moment after Mrs. Rouncewell has gone, who else would come to see Lady Dedlock but Mr. Guppy? And Mr. Guppy comes to warn her, because he now knows that the letters that he had been trying to get from her from Mr. Crook have actually gone to Mr. Smallweed. He doesn't know what's happened to them since, but he knows that there are people who now know everything about Lady Dedlock's past and want to reveal it to the world. So he has come to warn Lady Dedlock and goes away again. He has described Mr. Smallweed and the other people who know about the secret of Lady Dedlock's past, and Lady Dedlock finds out from Mercury that there have been those exact people there this morning. So everything is over. Sir Leicester Dedlock will now know, and she is so ashamed and so terrified of the future and so desperate that she leaves a note for Sir Leicester Dedlock and runs away and flies out into the night. So lots to talk about in this chapter. I guess it only skips a bit backwards in time and then kind of runs up to like the end of the previous chapter and that like same moment. So I guess like parts of this chapter kind of take place at the same time as the last chapter. So I guess that's kind of why it makes sense that it's unchronological, but still. Anyway, let's first talk about Mrs. Rouncewell and George. Did any of you realise that Mrs. Rouncewell was George's mother? Because I first experienced Bleak House in the television adaptation, where I was very surprised and had not worked it out. But reading the book, it feels like it's really obvious to me, but I did it at first just because obviously, like, I read the book knowing that, and I've known it for, like, a really long time, so of course it feels obvious for me when I'm reading Bleak House for, like, the 5th time. But I feel like it is quite obvious previously, so I wonder if anybody knows, or if it's not obvious, if you wouldn't kind of think to connect those two. But I like that it's Mrs. Rouncewell, and I like that they find each other again, and that George is reunited with his mother. And I like too that it's Mrs. Bagnet who finds her out and works it out, because Mrs. Bagnet is very intelligent and pretty awesome in general. I really like Mrs. Bagnet as a character. I think she's really cool. And yet we know too that Mrs. Rouncewell is not just distressed by her son's potential involvement in the murder, but also by Lady Dedlock's. This extreme disquiet of the old housekeeper's manner in saying this, her broken words and her wringing of her hands, make a powerful impression on Mrs. Bagnet, and would astonish her but that she refers them all to her sorrow for her son's condition. And yet Mrs. Bagnet wonders too why Mrs. Rouncewell should murmur so distractedly, "My lady, my lady, my lady," over and over again. And then we have the moment where George and his mother are reunited. The trooper starts up, clasps his mother round the neck, and falls down on his knees before her. Whether in a late repentance, whether in the first association that comes back upon him, he puts his hands together as a child does when it says its prayers, and raising them towards her breast, bows down his head and cries. I think it's such a powerful moment, because Mr. George is so like strong and collected a character that for then him to like fully break down the moment he sees his mother, because he's so happy to see her and so ashamed of his condition, it's just, I think, is really powerful. And he explains why he never came home and why he never wrote to her. There was I, a dragoon, roving unsettled, not self-made like his brother, but self-unmade. All my earlier advantages thrown away, all my little learning unlearned, nothing picked up but what was unfitted for most things that I could think of. What business had I to make myself known? This was the way I brought myself to think of it, mother, that my best amends was to lie upon the bed I had made and die upon it. And I should have done it, though I have been to see you more than once down at Chesney Wold when you little thought of me, but for my old comrade's wife here, who I find has been too many for me. But I thank her for it. I thank you for it, Mrs. Bagnet, with all my heart and might. I like Mrs. Bagnet very much. I like the scene between Lady Dedlock and Mrs. Rouncewell too, because in Mrs. Rouncewell making an appeal in this way to Lady Dedlock, who is her employer, she kind of puts them on a more equal footing, which I think is really, really powerful. As it fell dark last night, my lady, I got this letter. My lady, I have not breathed a word of it. I don't believe what's written in it. I know it can't be true. I am sure and certain that it is not true, but my son is in danger and you must have a heart to pity me. If you know of anything that is not known to others, if you have any suspicion, if you have any clue at all or any reason for keeping it in your own breast, oh my dear lady, think of me and conquer that reason and let it be known. This is what I consider most possible. I know you are not a hard lady, but you go your own way, always without help, and you are not familiar with your friends and all who admire you and all do as a beautiful and elegant lady. Know you to be one far away from themselves who can't be approached close. My lady, you may have some proud or angry reasons for disdaining to utter something that you know. If so, pray, oh pray, think of a faithful servant whose whole life has been passed in this family, which she loves dearly, and relent and help to clear my son. My lady, my good lady, I am so humble in my place, and you are by nature so high and distant, that you may not think what I feel for my child, but I feel so much that I have come here to make so bold as to beg and pray you not to be scornful of us, if you can do us any right or justice at this fearful time. And I like this, because although she is saying, I'm humble and I'm begging you, I am your servant, she's also claiming her right to be considered by a woman she has worked for all of her life, and claiming her right to an equal stake in the world and an equal stake to compassion, which I just really think is really powerful. And then of course she leaves, leaving Lady Dedlock with the piece of paper that has her own name and the word murderess on, and then who should turn up but Mr. Guppy. Now this chapter kind of puts Mr. Guppy a little bit more up in my esteem, because Mr. Guppy has no reason to go and see Lady Dedlock. He has no reason why he has to warn her. It isn't going to benefit him in any way now. He's given up Esther and has promised Esther to have nothing more to do with investigating her past, but at the same time, as soon as he knows from his friend Small that Grandfather Smallweed has worked something out about Lady Dedlock and that he has the letters, he comes to Lady Dedlock to warn her, because he is in some ways a nice man who means well and doesn't want to hurt people and doesn't want anyone to get hurt. And then he goes, and Lady Dedlock knows that she is ruined. So all is broken down. Her name is in these many mouths. Her husband knows his wrongs. Her shame will be published, maybe spreading while she thinks about it. In addition to the thunderbolts so long foreseen, so unforeseen by him, she is denounced by an invisible accuser as the murderess of her enemy. Her enemy he was, and she has often wished him dead. Her enemy he is, even in his grave. This dreadful accusation comes upon her like a new torment at his lifeless hand, and when she recalls how she was secretly at his door that night, and how she may be represented to have sent her favourite girl away so soon before, merely to release herself from observation, she shudders as if the hangman's hands were at her neck. She has thrown herself upon the floor and lies with all her hair wildly scattered and her face buried in the confusions of the couch. She rises up, hurries to and fro, flings herself down again and rocks and moans. The horror that is upon her is unutterable. If she really were the murderess, it could hardly be for a moment more intense. Thus a terrible impression steals upon her and overshadows her. There is no escape but in death. Hunted, she flies. The complication of her shame, her dread, remorse and misery overwhelms her at its height, and even her strength of self-reliance is overturned and whirled away like a leaf before a mighty wind. It's so powerful and written so well. She's such a fantastic character. And then there is a letter that she leaves for Sir Leicester Dedlock, which I find really powerful. If I am sought for or accused of his murder, believe that I am wholly innocent. Believe no other good of me, for I am innocent of nothing else that you have heard or will hear laid to my charge. He prepared me on that fatal night for his disclosure of my guilt to you. After he had left me, I went out on the pretence of walking in the garden where I sometimes walk, but really to follow him and make one last petition that he would not protract that dreadful suspense on which I had been racked by him, you do not know how long, but would mercifully strike the next morning. I found his house dark and silent. I rang twice at his door, but there was no reply, and I came home. I have no home left. I will encumber you no more. May you, in your just resentment, be able to forget the unworthy woman to whom you have wasted a most generous devotion, who avoids you only with a deeper shame than that with which she hurries from herself, and who writes this last adieu. It's pretty powerful stuff. I think this chapter is written fantastically, and this whole section I think is just written beautifully by Dickens. I think it's, really powerful. So let's move on to chapter 56, Pursuit. In this, we learn that Lady Dedlock has indeed run away, and that Sir Leicester Dedlock is incredibly ill. He is in such a state that he can barely speak, and in order to communicate has to write shakily on a slate with a pencil. But through this, he manages to communicate how worried he is that Lady Dedlock has disappeared and how desperate he is to find her. He summons Mr. Bucket there because Mr. Bucket, he believes, will be able to find Lady Dedlock, and he writes full forgiveness on the slate to show that he wants Lady Dedlock found and that he is not angry with her and is not upset with her and that he blames her nothing and that he only wants her to come home. Mrs. Rouncewell is also there looking after Sir Leicester Dedlock, and Mr. Bucket assures her that her son is safe and that he has taken somebody else into custody. And then he goes upstairs to search through Lady Dedlock's belongings to see if he can find out anything that might suggest to him where Lady Dedlock has gone. And what he does find is a handkerchief with the name Esther Summerson imprinted into it. and knowing that Lady Dedlock had a daughter, the truth springs upon Mr. Bucket at once. He goes to Mr. George, who he knows Esther Summerson, to get the address, and then goes to Mr. Jarndyce to gather Esther, to bring Esther with him to try and find Lady Dedlock, because he thinks that if he comes with Esther, Lady Dedlock will know that he is coming with a friend and that he is coming to try and help her as a friend, not to accuse her of murder or anything like that. And they will go together out into the night to try and find Lady Dedlock. So, points of interest in this chapter. First, I just want to talk about Sir Leicester Dedlock because like I said, I love him a lot. I have a great place in my heart for Sir Leicester Dedlock. He fell down this morning, a handsome, stately gentleman, somewhat infirm but of a fine present and with a well-filled face. He lies upon his bed, an aged man with sunken cheeks, the decrepit shadow of himself. His voice was rich and mellow, and he had so long been thoroughly persuaded of the weight and import to mankind of any word he said that his words really had come to sound as if there was something in them. But now he can only whisper, and what he whispers sounds like what it is, mere jumble and jargon. And when he cannot speak, he instead writes upon a slate, and what he writes first is Chesney Wold, ? Mrs. Rouncewell takes it to be him asking, is he in Chesney Wold? But in fact, he is asking, is Lady Dedlock at Chesney Wold? He then writes, my lady, and then, my lady, for God's sake, where? He then writes Mr. B in order to get Mr. Bucket there, and wants him to find Lady Dedlock. Sir Leicester writes upon the slate, full forgiveness, find. Mr. Bucket stops his hand. Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, I'll find her. I love this moment. Like I said, I think one of the most powerful things about Sir Leicester Dedlock as a character, and one of the reasons why he's such a fantastic character, is that this haughty, proud man who disdains everyone below him entirely forgives his wife a action and a past which within the Victorian period is considered abhorrent. Like within the Victorian period, this is ruin and scandal of the worst kind, and the fact that Lady Dedlock married a man of his social standing with the past that she has would be considered by the Victorian period appalling. But Sir Leicester Dedlock doesn't care because he loves her, and that means nothing to him, despite all his pride and all his vanity and all of his obsession with the family name and the family credit. All he actually cares about is her, and I just think it's wonderful, and it's sad because I don't think she loves him in the same way he loves her, but I just think it's incredibly powerful, and Sir Leicester Dedlock is just such a fantastic character because of it. I also enjoy in this chapter what Mr. Bucket says to Mrs. Rouncewell, because I think it does prove that Mr. Bucket has a genuine affection for George. You needn't be distressed no more. Your son's all right. Now don't you begin to crying, because what you've got to do is take care of Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, and you won't do that by crying. As for your son, he's all right, I tell you, and he sends his loving duty and hoping you're the same. His discharge honourable. That's about what he is, with no more imputation on his character than there is on yours, and yours is a tidy one, I'll bet a pound. You may trust me, for I took your son. He conducted himself in the gameway too on that occasion, and he's a fine made man, and you're a fine man, old lady, and you're a mother and son, the pair of you, as might be showed for models in a caravan. Mr. Bucket is so weird, but I also kind of like him, and I think it's because he's quite eccentric that I do like him, and that I find him quite a nice character, and also because I do think that he likes George, and he got George off because he knew George wasn't guilty, and he did find the correct culprit in the end, and I like that as well. And I like too that he genuinely wants to find Lady Dedlock and stop anything bad happening to her, and that he purposefully goes to find Esther in order that he may appear to Lady Dedlock as a friend. He says to Mr. Jarndyce, if I follow her alone, she, being in ignorance of what Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, has communicated to me, may be driven to desperation. But if I follow her in company with a young lady, answering to the description of a young lady that she has a tenderness for, I ask no question and say no more than that, she will give me credit for being friendly. And then Mr. Jarndyce goes upstairs to talk to Esther and to bring her down again, which is quite interesting because this is the first moment that we get really close to seeing Esther in the third person perspective, though we don't actually see her. We end the chapter with Mr. Bucket waiting at the door for Esther Summerson to come down, but it's quite interesting because this is the closest we get in the third person perspective to Esther being literally just upstairs. And the chapter ends with Mr. Bucket in his mind kind of trying to imagine where Lady Dedlock might be and thinking about finding her, and that's how that chapter ends. So a lot of drama in the chapters we read in July, and lots to come in August as well. We're so near the end of the read-along now. It's such a fantastic novel. So in the month of August, which is already underway, we will be reading the following 3 chapters. Chapter 57, Esther's narrative, Chapter 58, A Wintry Day and Night, and Chapter 59, Esther's narrative. And after that, we'll be on to September's chapters, which are the final chapters of the book. So please let me know down in the comments what you thought of this month's chapters and how you're getting on with Bleak House, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.